Hi, Misha here, and in this little series I'm going to be looking at modern American strategic bombers, the three we have in service today. This video will be on the B-52, the Stratofortress. Then we'll move in the next video to the B-1B Lancer. And then finally, of course, we will wrap up with the B-2 Spirit, the stealth bomber. But today, and probably what will be the longest video, we're going to look at the B-52, known as the Buff, or Big Ugly Fat Fucker, or Big Ugly Fat Feller, if you're, I guess, a Mormon in the Air Force. I'm not sure. Probably the most famous bomber in U.S. service after World War II. All of these models are 1/200 scale die-cast from Herpa. You can understand why 1/200 is kind of necessary. I mean, this is a foot wide wingspan, even at that, and it's quite heavy, a couple of pounds. Honestly, I would prefer a 144, but that's getting quite big, and no one really does a 144 these days for the B-52. Corgi once did one, but it wasn't great. And even if I had a 144 B-52, I don't know where I would find a B-1 and a B-2 to match it. I kind of want all these in the same scale. The only real downside to the Herpas is that the landing gear's in the down position, which always bugs me. But that's just something it is. And it doesn't bug me as much on the smaller scales and with the larger planes because the gear aren't as apparent. These do come with stands, but since they have their gear, I just like sitting them on their gear. With such a wingspan, I'm afraid this would get knocked over. Alrighty, well, on to the long history of the B-52. By the way, this is a G variant. B-52G. You can tell by the tail gun. This dates all the way back to right after the end of World War II. In November of '45, the U.S. Air Forces, still operating under the Army, issued specifications for a new long-range strategic bomber to replace the B-29. Of course, you know, when they issued these proposals, they know they're years out. So the B-29 had been in service a couple of years, and it was expected to remain in service for some time longer. But, you know, gotta get ahead of the game. And of course, this would need to be nuclear capable, and they had quite stringent range, payload, and speed requirements. Anyway, in early 1946, around February, they opened up the contest for companies to submit designs. Boeing, Consolidated, and Martin were really the three big ones that submitted. And in June, Boeing was selected. I mean, they'd been very successful with their previous bombers. Not to say Consolidated and Martin had delivered poor bombers, but Boeing had a lot of experience after the whole B-29 project. And an initial contract for prototypes was issued in late June of that year. And then things get complicated. I'm just going to summarize the entirety of the second half of 1946 as Boeing made updates. Air Force changed their mind and updated their requirements. Boeing made more updates. Air Force changed their mind again. On and on and on. Finally, in June, so a year later, 47, Boeing's pretty much met everything the Air Force wants, except maybe their prototype design. Remember, this is still just an on-paper design. Didn't quite have the range, but it did everything else. Problem is, at this time in 1947, technology is progressing forward leaps and bounds. And the Air Force is worried that this so-called B-52 project is already outdated before it's even into production. So, they put basically a 6-month hold on the whole program. Let's just, stop, 6 months, collect. Well, Boeing used this time to continue to refine their Model 646 design, which they went through many revisions over the years. Meanwhile, the Air Force basically decided at the end of that year just to cancel the whole contract, the whole program, just screw it, throw it in the trash. Well, thanks to a lot of lobbying from Boeing and others, the project was saved. So in 48, Boeing was encouraged to try to update and modernize their design. How much new tech can you integrate into your existing basic design? And one new thing that Boeing worked with for a heavy bomber was the jet engine, which, was coming onto line for a lot of fighters, but not many bombers in that time. They tried out, at least on paper again, the idea of jet engines in July of 48, and this really helped the plane with range, payload, speed, all of that. But what it didn't do was fuel efficiency. And the Air Force did not like this. They still wanted to keep using turboprop engines so it didn't consume as much fuel. But then Boeing kept saying, if you want everything else you want, you have to make a sacrifice somewhere. So finally by 49, it was decided, okay, we're going to have to go with the jet engine. So, in early 1951, Boeing was awarded a contract to produce 13 I don't want to say, pre-production models with jet engines. And in April of 52, the very first, actually I should back up, it was actually the second prototype, to be fair, B-52, but early generation, took its first test flight. And reports from 1952 were so positive, after this many years in development, it's at least good that something went right, that the Air Force quickly updated their order to 282, and Boeing got to work. It's also worth pointing out that just a short time later in 1952, the B-52B version was introduced with several updates. So actually the B-52A, only a few were produced, none ever saw active service, they were all used for testing and training. So really the B-52B was the first active version. By the way, just so I complete, when the new contract was issued in 1951, this went from an XB-52 to XB-52A. So kind of the A was just the early prototype jet versions. And anyway, Boeing got to work. They actually were producing these at 2 factories early on, up in Washington, Spokane, and not quite near here in Kansas at Wichita. And this became America's first true jet, strategic, heavy bomber. The B-52 was loosely based, at least starting off point, from Boeing's earlier B-47 design. Had a total of 8 jet engines, overall length of just over 159 feet, a wingspan of right at 185 feet, had a crew of 6, including pilot, co-pilot, electronics officer, and a tail gunner. It was the only turreted position left at this point because modern jet bombers really didn't have a use for other turrets, but this was just to catch anything in behind. Initially it would have 4 50 caliber Browning machine gun types back here. It could get up to about 650 miles per hour, so quite fast. Still subsonic, but still quite very fast for the size. It could climb to about 50,000 feet, although to be fair, performance would diminish. It preferred around 42, 43,000 for just ideal. On paper, it could carry up to 70,000 pounds of ordnance, although again, in practice, unless you made drastic sacrifices for range, it was more like 60,000. The good news is it was mixed ordnance. Yes, it was nuclear capable, but it could also carry conventional weapons. The cockpit inside is quite interesting. It's kind of a split level design. It also has mini landing gear. It has several under the fuselage and then 2 small ones, one on each wing. Just a very big, massive aircraft. As I said, the B-52B design came about in June of '52. The first ones flew in 1954 and started to be delivered to the Air Force. In mid-1955, they began testing and evaluation, and the first wing of B-52Bs was declared fully operational in March of 1956. But these early planes were not without issues. I mean, anything new is not going to be, and it was a very complicated plane. Just as the B-29 before it, the B-52 had early on issues. For one, its computers were unreliable at first. For another, it had problems with fuel leaking out of the fuel tanks. They also discovered that due to this thing's weight and size, it was wreaking hell with existing Air Force taxiways and runways. It was kind of destroying the tarmac because, again, its weight. But probably the worst thing, in February of 1956, there was a crash that killed the crew. It crashed after takeoff. So the fleet was temporarily grounded early that year, but then was quickly put back into service after some updates were made. Then things start to get better. In 1957, this set several records for speed and distance. In fact, a flight of B-52s made a round-the-world trip. And Boeing had been hard at work turning out these planes at both factories for 5 years. Then in 1957, they switched full production to the plant in Kansas so that the one in Washington could focus on other projects, including civilian planes. And production would continue from there. After its introduction, the B-52's first role is a high altitude deterrent, nuclear deterrent. It was used in famous Operation Chrome Dome and others. But as with other bombers we'll be talking about, as Soviet radar and missile and jet interceptor technology improved greatly, around 1960, the B-52's role was changed from high altitude strategic bomber to low altitude penetration bomber. And this was actually pretty hard on the airframe and required a number of updates to the design, but after several years of improvements, it actually weathered the change better than a lot of other bombers of the era, like for example the Vickers Valiant. In 1959, the G variant here was introduced. It was a major overhaul as well. It went to what's called a wet wing, where fuel is stored in the wing. There's also fuel tanks on the wings. It introduced a new radar dome in the front. It also relocated the lonely tail gunner from the back up to the cockpit with the rest of the civilized world, and many, many other changes. And then finally, in 1961, around May, the B-52H, the final version, was introduced. It had uprated engines, a new fire control system, and these 50 caliber guns were got rid of and replaced with a 20 millimeter M61 Vulcan cannon. And the last B-52 was shipped from Boeing to the Air Force in October of 1962 with around 740 produced in total. So a very respectable number. The G was the most produced version, with nearly 150 made, and over 100 of the H were made. The earlier planes, like the B variant, were retired out by 1966, and then early versions like the C would be retired around 1970. Then the B-52 entered Vietnam. While this was made with conventional ordnance as a possibility, nuclear bombing was kind of always its primary goal. So in 1964, 24 B-52Fs were modified to convey conventional bombs. Later, more would be modified since the first ones were successful, and these started to be used in Vietnam that year. 1965, you have Operation Rolling Thunder. They were used. The first major bombing raid over North Vietnam happened in June of that year. And then later that year, the B-52D, which was a dedicated bomber, long-range bomber variant, was updated with what was called the Big Belly update, which gave it more internal bomb load for conventional bombs, and this would result in the infamous carpet bombings beginning in late 1966. The first B-52 to be confirmed to be shot down was in 1972. And really that was the zenith of this plane's use in that war, when the most were flying, the most hours. And they were used very heavily in December in Operation Linebacker. In total, 31 of these planes would be lost in the war. 17 would be shot down. The rest would be lost to accidents like mid-air collisions or, accidents on the ground. So the attrition rate got rather high at the end of the war, which makes sense as newer and newer fighters and more came online. After Vietnam, pretty much all the earlier versions were retired out. although the D version would soldier on longer than the rest. In fact, it was upgraded in the 70s, and a lot of the Ds were not actually retired until the early 80s, leaving the G and the H to kind of be the B-52 fleet. Now at this point, they had already expected the B-52 to go out of service to something newer, like the XB-70 Valkyrie or the B-58 Hustler. But every time they tried to find a replacement for this plane, the project was either canceled or it just was a disappointment. It didn't have everything the B-52 has. This has really good payload, all things considered, for its range and cost and everything else. It does a lot of things quite good, if nothing especially perfectly. It's just a good all-around, and it's very adaptable. These were updated to fire cruise missiles, for example. Also, they were updated to launch target drones. They were updated to use ECM equipment, electronic countermeasures. They just proved to be one of those planes that you could pretty much just gut and start over. I mean, engines were changed multiple times. Again, we even added the wet wing system, so it just had that staying power, whereas other designs, maybe more modern, did not. Therefore, despite everything, this was still very much in frontline use as we roll in to the 1980s, and it's still very much at the tip of the Air Force's, or I should say the government's, nuclear triad, which consisted of the Air Force's bomber wing and ICBMs and the Navy's submarine fleet. It was very much kind of a tried and trusted deterrent and kind of a symbol of Americana at this point, because it had been in service so long. Even though manufacturing had ended 20 years earlier, they were updating and maintaining the planes, and they proved to be amenable to that. While the early planes had reached kind of the end of their service life, the later planes proved to have more durable airframes. And so the B-52 would outlast the Cold War itself and continue on. Well, as the Cold War was winding down, the B-52Gs and Hs went into combat. In January of 1991, they began bombing raids over Iraq in Operation Desert Storm. They delivered a high amount of the ordnance in that 6-week war. At first, they were operating at low altitudes for precision and, frankly, psychological purposes. Later, they would be switched to high-altitude operations. While a few would suffer damage during the war, none were actually lost in combat. And they would kind of earn a good track record. Later that year, they would stop being put on 24-hour nuclear standby alert. And then in October, the tail gun, which was a cannon at this point on the H's, would be removed from the B-52. And of course, that meant the 6th crew member would be removed, dropping the crew down to 5. Then the START treaty with Russia, addressing nuclear weapons, would be signed, and as part of it, America would agree to destroy, with Soviet observation, 365 B-52s in total, pretty much the entire G fleet. So the G would go out of service in 1994, leaving the H the only version. It would continue to be used for precision bombing. Its guidance and everything had been updated over time. For example, it had received GPS. So later it was able to deliver smart bombs, guided bombs. So it was used in Kosovo. It was used in the Afghan campaign starting in 2001. And then, of course, it went back to Iraq in 2003. At this point, these were used to destroy strategic targets, and also they started to be used for close air support. They had loiter time. They could aid the troops on the ground if called in for an airstrike. To this end, in 2007, they were given a lightning pod, kind of like the A-10 has, to help with this mission. And they continue to be used today. Of course, with many updates and changes, but refurbishments. As of last year, the Air Force has 58 B-52s in active service, and another 18 or so are mothballed that could be brought back if ever needed. So potentially we could have about 75 or so in the sky again if we just needed to. And this plane's retirement keeps getting pushed back and back. I mean, it was once said to be 2045. Now people are projecting 2050 beyond, which means this plane very well could cross the century mark, which is just damn amazing, frankly. But if it does the job, and hey, the money's been put, I mean, it still costs money to fly and maintain these, but at least research and development, has been done a long time ago. Yes, newer planes like the B-1 and B-2 have replaced the B-52. For example, the B-52 stopped being issued with nuclear bombs in 2010. That role went over to the B-2 here. And the B-1 still does do some high-profile strategic bombing when speed's needed, but when just raw power is needed and kind of the big hit, they still call upon the B-52, the Buff. So, by any measure, although its first few years were a bit rocky, it is a successful design. And that's as brief as I can make this plane's history. I know this is already a long video, but that was me editing out a ton. But good grief, this thing's been in service longer than most people's parents or even grandparents have been alive. It saw, the Cuban Missile Crisis. It saw the Vietnam War. It saw multiple times in Iraq. It has been around. As I said, this is a Herpa model. I do like that it's mostly all metal. The tail fins, of course, are plastic, and the engines, but the body and the wings are metal. It has decent detail, considering its small scale. It's a catch-22. If you go larger, you end up with a very, very big model. I think the size is fine. I just wish landing gear were optional up or down. That's just me, though. That is just me. This is the G. They also have an H model. I just thought the G was more interesting. And it's the most mass-produced one. There's very few left in the world. Those that are there have been disabled for static displays. All the active ones were cut up 20 years ago. Alrighty guys, it's gone on long enough. I appreciate you sticking with me. Any questions? Feel free to post them below. Otherwise, I will catch you very soon next time.